Abi ya.
Ne sesi? Tüfek sesi mi?
Yok ya. Ya domuz ya elikti ya.
I love it in pancakes and porridge every morning with goat's milk. I don't know, it's just...
The architect is influenced by their surroundings throughout their life. No design can be born without reference to prior experiences. Glassy tells us that buildings, like poems and rituals, are realizations of cultural familiarity. Henry Glassy is the professor of folklore at Indiana University, with cultural studies spanning places as widespread as Ireland, Turkey, and Bangladesh. Vernacular Architecture, published in 2000, is the culmination of his observations on the architecture present in these cultures. Vernacular architecture is a term which is used to describe types of structures varying from the igloo to the Midwestern farmhouse. The term usually invokes thoughts on local materials and their proximity to the site. Glassy identifies architecture as the realization of relationships between people and their activities in material form. Through this process, purpose and identity is given to these materials. Throughout the book, Glassy questions our understanding of what vernacular architecture is, in order to evaluate the history and culture which has produced it. Glassy never explicitly labels the features which define an architecture as vernacular. Rather, he provides extensive documentation and analysis of vernacular examples found in recent history. Probably the most common definition of vernacular architecture is the construction of nomadic or permanent dwellings through the use of local materials. Historically, these materials were collected and harvested by groups of native inhabitants, and then moved the short distance to the construction site, and assembled as a team utilizing the skills of every individual. The use of resources from the immediate vicinity result in vernacular dwellings that often tended to blend into their surroundings, such as those loam houses by natives of the high Atlas Mountains in Morocco. Henry Glassy examines several forms of architecture that are considered vernacular due to their use of local materials, such as the stone used in the Burton Bradstock building in Dorset. Further examples of this definition of vernacular through local materials are prevalent in architectural history. The natural resources have not been put through an industrial process that he does not understand in a factory at some great distance, as common in Western construction. Glassy writes that the industrial process erases nature, removing the connection between material origin and inhabitant. Here the words erasing nature are particularly important, implying that the industrial process in modern construction are so numerous and so disconnected from the inhabitant that they destroy all connections in the relationship between resources and occupant. Each mechanical process and treatment applied to the material and each consignment in the journey from origin to building site severs another connection that would have remained intact if the architecture had been vernacular. Throughout Glassier's study of vernacular architecture, there is one identifying aspect which remains constant, which is closely linked to the scene earlier depicting the fragmentation of today's construction industry. The immediacy of the connections between all those involved in the building project is a defining feature of vernacular architecture. In the construction of a piece of vernacular architecture, not only the architect, builder, contractor, engineer, and often client are the same person, but if the roles are divided, they are amongst people who share a very close cultural and social link. Glassier suggests that the more communication is required between parties involved, the less they share an understanding of the project. In vernacular projects, the simplest plans will suffice, as all those involved have an intimate knowledge of what the outcome will be and what the construction requires, because it is what the community has lived in for centuries. In modern society, designers create products and commodities for clients and customers, whom they never meet in person. This is a point which Glassier uses to illustrate how modern design steps away from modern vernacular. However, the exact transition from the vernacular to the non-vernacular is not divulged by Glassier. An explanation for why the immediacy of connections are such an integral part of vernacular architecture is that it is the path of least resistance. In a work of vernacular architecture, most decisions are made on the basis that it is the most practical option and is in keeping with what already exists. It has therefore become difficult to identify what can be considered vernacular today, because in much the same way the industrialization has removed the need for materials to be locally sourced, the increase in communication technologies mean that in order for the client and the people they are working with to share communications and cultural values, their immediacy is no longer defined geographically. Glassier shows us, using examples of how the combination of economic constraints and industrialization have both confused the definition of vernacular architecture and shaped it. A key economic factor of vernacular architecture which Glassier identifies is that in rural communities the typology of the housing is often dictated by the land upon which the community farms. Village typology with communal farmland would be used. Typically this is found throughout pre-industrial Europe. Few examples have survived today. One of these is Broughton in Devon. In areas with less fertile land, for example in mountainous regions, the longhouse or similar structure is favoured. However, Glassier points out that not all vernacular settlements follow this pattern, with dispersed village housing found in Turkey despite the harsh landscape. This suggests that social and cultural factors also play a significant role throughout many different cultures. One example is that of the communities in rural Bangladesh. There, the house is a series of bedrooms in individual buildings, typically made from clay, which share a more open kitchen with a pitched roof and dried bamboo walls. However, as industrialization has given these communities access to new materials, such as concrete and corrugated iron, those who can afford to select these building materials instead, as their durability makes them more long-term economic sense. This gives rise to the question of whether vernacular architecture can exist in a post-industrial society, or if these new networks of construction infrastructure, as well as the tendency for work to move from the home to the factory, results in the abolishment of the vernacular. This is a question which Glassier never directly confronts, and instead divides the vernacular into three separate periods: the village, the house, and the commodity. In the period of the commodity, the focus is on the culture which results in the function and therefore the form of the house. The decoration is then chosen from books of plans and details and customized by the builder and the client in order to portray their status. In the period of the commodity, the line between what is considered vernacular and what is not has blurred, if not entirely vanished.